Okay, so it has just about been 6 months since I started my booktube channel, which technically means we are this close to being halfway through the year, and I thought I would celebrate by discussing my top 10 books of the first half of the year, as well as my bottom 10 books for the first half of the year. We will do a top 10 books in another video, but today we are going to talk about my least favourite of all the books that I've read so far. To this point where I am filming this video, I have read 50 books, which I can't believe I've read 50 books in 6 months. It's a massive moment for me, and I'm currently reading my 51st. But today, we get to weed out all of the books that were my least favourite of those 50 that I have read. Now, I'm going to premise this video by saying that I don't have all of those books on me because, well, when you have books that you don't like, what can sometimes happen is you end up giving them away. So, there we go. I will also premise this video by saying that despite the fact that these books do appear here and that they are my least favourite for the first half of 2020, I did not DNF them, I did get through them, and also you may love these books, it's just that they weren't working for me. So let's get into it, starting with the book that comes in at 10th place, the 10th placed book that I least hated that I've... the 10th placed book that I least liked this year, for the first half of this year, and that 10th place book is a book I don't have on me anymore called Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Now, I've actually given this book away to my niece who really loves Stephen King and everything that he's about, which I think is good. It took me a while to get into Stephen King, and we'll see if I get into reading other Stephen King books as we progress into the second half of 2020. But I will set this up by saying that when I came to reading Pet Sematary, it was in a month where I decided to branch out and read books of all different genres that I hadn't read before. Of course, every single month I wanted to include fantasy because it is my favourite genre of book, but horror is something that I hadn't read in an incredibly long time. In fact, I think the last time I read a horror, I was either in primary school or elementary school if you're American, or really early on in high school, but I hadn't read a horror in a very long time. I'm not a fan of horror films, I don't like them at all, so it's very rare for you to see me, or for me to be, I should say, watching a horror film, but the books, I don't so much mind. So I decided to dip my toe into this world with Pet Sematary. The problem with this book was not the writing style, it was not the plot either. The problem that I had at that time with this particular book was that I entered into this book wanting to receive out of it certain expectations. I wanted this book to hit some certain marks, and especially because it was a horror, I wanted it to scare me. I wanted to be so freaked out that I would not be able to go to bed without having the light on. I wanted to just have moments where my heart would be racing, and it just did not happen for me. And so I will recommend all of these books to those who like these kind of things, but for me with Pet Sematary, it just didn't scare me, and that's why it got a low rating from me. It got 2 stars. Now, it's not my most hated book for the first half of the year, it's my 10th hated book, but this book, Pet Sematary, focuses more on grief and loss rather than... It kind of substitutes grief and loss for anything overly horrific. So if you would like to try out reading a horror book that isn't going to overly scare you, will deal with death in more of a way of post-death rather than the actual death itself, then I definitely would recommend Pet Sematary. It is rated rather highly with a lot of people. It didn't work for me because it didn't do what I wanted it to do. So let's get over to the 9th hated book that I had for all the books I've read in 2020. And my 9th least favourite book for the first half of the year was this book, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, in April, I decided to read the Lord of the Rings quadrilogy, so The Hobbit plus the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and every single week I started off the week with one of those books, going obviously in order from week 1 through to week 4, and I did this because I was celebrating my friend having a birthday that month, and it is her favourite series, so I thought, I've never seen it, never thought I would like it, let's try and get into the book series. One of the biggest regrets I walk away from that month with was the fact that I forced myself to read those 4 books in the 1 month, and I granted them all immunity. In other words, I could not DNF them, I had to get through the series, and I deeply regret doing that because I didn't like any of them, and pretty much most, if not all of them, are going to feature in this video, and The Hobbit comes in 9th place. There are some glowing moments in this book. In fact, the first chapter is rather hilarious, and I found myself laughing most of the way through it. And then about halfway through the book, there is a character that comes in. I won't say too much about who it is. I don't want to give away too many spoilers. But I will say that any time that character came in, the level of intrigue for me spiked because it was always a good scene that I was reading. But aside from that, I found this book to be somewhat boring, I have to admit, and what was born out of this book was my realization for my dislike of traveling/questing tropes, particularly if you don't know where you're going. I feel in this book they kind of do know where they're going, but it's still a traveling/questing trope, and I just did not enjoy it at all. Also, J.R.R. Tolkien's writing style takes a lot to get used to. While other writers might take a line or two to describe a tree, J.R.R. Tolkien will take 10 pages, and it really takes you out of the story itself. Now, if you love traveling/questing books, then you might love this book. It is a middle grade fantasy, although the magic system it's greatly underused in my opinion. There is a wizard who features in this book, but we really don't see either a lot or any magic from this wizard at all for the majority of the series itself as a whole, so do keep that in mind. The Lord of the Rings quadrilogy is very much loved. Again, this is a personal opinion, it's just not the series for me, and so The Hobbit came in 9th place for the books that I least loved for the first half of 2020. Coming in at number 8 is this book, The Last Smile in Sunder City by Luke Arnold. This is a book that I read this month, and I don't want to talk too much about it now because I am going to be talking about it in quite a lot of detail, spoiler-free detail, when we get to the end of this month when I do my monthly wrap-up. But I went into this book with a lot of high expectations because the premise of this book sounded really amazing. Basically, this book is set in a high fantasy world where there are a ton of magical beings and creatures who no longer have magic anymore because, here's the twist, the magic has run out. So I thought it would be really interesting to see how this would go, reading a book in such an environment where the beings still exist, they just don't have those powers anymore. See, the problem is, the book does stick to its premise, but the way that it came across in the end, it was just extremely dry. Not only the writing style, but also the world itself, and most importantly, our protagonist, Fetch Phillips, who is a detective for previously known magical beings, and it just came across extremely dry for me. But if you would like to visit a world where magic once existed, where the creatures or beings who once were magical are still there, they just don't have access to magic, then I would recommend reading The Last Smile in Sunder City. It's just because the writing style for me came across as extremely dry, it just was a book that I did not enjoy at all, and that's what made it number 8 on my list. Coming in at number 7 is this book, The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. Okay, so the very first book in the quadrilogy is The Hobbit. This is the final book in that quadrilogy, and they were okay. And when I'm measuring those two books up against the other two books in the quadrilogy, they were my favourites. But when I'm measuring them up against all the other books that I've read so far this year, yeah, not so good. There are some good moments that do occur, however, in this book. One thing that I will say is that the protagonist and his friends, well, not the protagonist, but some of the characters come across this creature that is a tree that comes to life, and his name is Treebeard, and I really enjoyed this so much. I don't remember what they're called. I think they're called Ents. These characters, these trees that move and talk, they're rather sentient trees, and I really did appreciate that. Also, the book wrapped up. The series, sorry, I should say, wraps up with this book. So what the driving force behind the plot is all about finally comes to fruition in this book, and I really appreciated seeing what we were working towards finally happen, so that I appreciate it as well. But again, it was J.R.R. Tolkien. I don't appreciate his writing style. The majority of it was boring. The descriptions of things were just going on for way too long. Also, there was a ton of showing rather than telling. So if you don't know the difference between the two, if you are writing a book and you're wanting to show your readers what is going on, you will give them the action as it is playing out and have them read that. If you are telling them, if you're telling your readers about what's going on, then you are literally either telling them as the narrator, or you're having another character recount what has happened, and you don't actually get to be there at the time as this moment is being carried out. There is a ton of showing as opposed to telling that occurs in this book, and yeah, that coupled with J.R.R. Tolkien's writing style and just other things along the way, including very heavy descriptions, placed this book where it was. At number 7. Coming in at number 6 is a book that I don't have because I borrowed it from the library. It is a book called Once by Morris Gleitzman. You can feel free to look that up. So the backstory to that book is that I have a friend whose child was going into his first year of high school this year, so I offered to read his textbooks so that I could assist him with that because he doesn't like to read. One of those books was Once. Now, let's talk a little bit about the author, Morris Gleitzman. Morris Gleitzman is an amazing author. Here in Australia, he is a very well-known author. I grew up reading a lot of his books, which were rather humorous and extremely comical, and they were just so much fun to read. Not so with Once. Once is not a comical book at all. It's probably... well, it certainly is the first Morris Gleitzman book that I've read that's a serious book, because it's incredibly serious. So the basic premise is that it follows the protagonist, who is a Jewish boy who is being raised in an orphanage in war-torn Warsaw, Poland, during the reign of the Nazis and the Third Reich, and so you can imagine how all that went down. It was a very hard book to read emotionally because there are moments where this child experiences certain things and believes them to be certain things because he is a child that are extremely innocent, where we as either readers or especially if you're reading it as an adult, we kind of know what's going on. For example, and this doesn't give away too much at all considering I've already told you the premise, there is a scene where the child walks past a wood or a forest of sorts, and he hears a loud bang, and he starts to wonder why someone is letting off a firework where, we know that it's not a firework, we know it's a gunshot. So, that made it really hard to read as well. But even if I were to put my emotions aside, I just didn't enjoy the book as a whole. I don't like war books at all. They're just not my thing. So that's why that book ended up where it was on the list, which was at number 6. Coming in at number 5 is another book that I don't have. This is a book that I did purchase. I purchased it from my own store, and I have since given it away because of the fact that I don't like it. I thought I still had it, but I went for a look around, can't find it, so I've worked out now that I have, in fact, given it away. And it is called The Replacement by Brenna Yovanov. This book is a fantasy book, however, it is extremely low fantasy. It is set in our own world. So in case you didn't know the difference, that is what it is. Low fantasy books are books that have fantastical elements in them, but they're set in our own world. High fantasy books are books that have fantastical elements set in a world that is completely new and completely made up by the author. To give you an example, Harry Potter, that series, is a low fantasy series. Not that there are low fantastical elements that occur in the book, but because it is still set in our world, despite the fact that Hogwarts is a magical school, it still exists in our world. It exists in the UK. So, so that makes it a low fantasy. This book too is a low fantasy, The Replacement by Brenna Yovanov, and it revolves around Mackie, who is a high school student, and we don't really know much about him at all for the whole first half of the book, other than the fact that there are a lot of things that make him feel very ill, and that was a little bit off-putting. It takes until the halfway mark for anything to happen, because the first half of the book seems to be more just like an everyday high school contemporary, I guess. And finally, in the second half of the book, we get into fantastical elements. But as much as we do get into those fantastical elements in the second half of the book, and the final climax that does occur is a good one, it wasn't enough to make up for the first half, and also the fantastical elements are still rather low in and of themselves. And so that's why that book made it where it did on this list. At number 5. Coming in at number 4 then is a contemporary book called Pool Boy by Michael Simmons. This is a book that I read in that same month where I was reading Pet Sematary, where I wanted to branch out and read all different genres, and this was the first contemporary book that I had read in an extremely long time. I generally read fantasies, and even prior to my booktube channel coming about, I was reading more witch, wizard, magician, or even vampire, type books. So I read a lot of fantasy. This is the first contemporary that I read. Now, for those of you wondering what a contemporary is, basically the way that I see contemporaries, different people will define it differently, but it basically means the same thing. A contemporary is a book that is it's more the opposite to fantasy. So even though it is a work of fiction, it's a work of fiction that's based off things that can happen in everyday life anyway. So, but it is also a work of fiction that can happen in everyday life that doesn't come under any other category. So for example, if you have a book that is set in everyday life circumstances that has a whole lot of love going on, that would be called a romance. But if it doesn't have a whole lot of love going on, and it really can't be categorized except for the fact that it's set in our world and it's kind of the same thing that anyone can go through at any given time, it's a contemporary. So that's this book, Pool Boy. Not only is it a contemporary, which that I knew going in, what I did not know going in is that this is a character-driven book, and I am a plot-driven reader. So one of the things that I end up working out with this book, and I've always said, I find that with negative situations in life, as tough as they are to go through, you learn so much more from them. And with J.R.R. Tolkien's the Lord of the Rings series, what I realize is I don't like traveling, questing tropes, especially when you don't know where you're going or how you're going to get there. With this book, what I realize is I'm not a character-driven book at all. Now, for those of you who don't know what character-driven is versus plot-driven, a plot-driven book is a book that focuses mostly on the plot. most standard books are going to be plot driven because that's more the common thing that you see, is that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it drives the reader through a plot. In character driven books, there is still a plot there most of the time, although the plot in this book is very minimal. I mean, I'd probably say about 20 pages of this book was plot and the rest was character driven. So I want to give you an example of a difference between, and this is just an example that I'm just pulling out of the air, between a plot-driven story and a character-driven story. So let's say with a plot-driven story, you have a character who is going to go to their friend's place and they're going to go play video games. On the way, this protagonist ends up going into a supermarket to buy a chocolate bar. In a plot-driven story, the character goes into the supermarket, finds which chocolate bar they want, goes to the register, pays for it, leaves, and goes on to their friend's place to play the video game, because it drives the plot forward. In a character-driven book, the character will go into the supermarket, have a tough time trying to work out which chocolate bar they're going to find because they don't know, and they have to think about which chocolate bar is going to be the best one to suit them, the character. Then they will be thinking about the price, and is this too expensive? Is it not too expensive? Can I justify paying this much for this chocolate bar? And then once they've come to those conclusions, then they start thinking about what other people will think. Okay, I'm going to my friend's place, so buying this chocolate bar, is this going to be enough for me? Can I share this with my friend? Well, does my friend even like this chocolate bar? And so on and so forth. And it is extremely annoying for me. There are people out there who love character-driven books, but I'm not a fan of that. I much prefer for my books to be plot-driven. Because this book was 95% character-driven, I just did not appreciate it. The premise, however, is really good, and it sounded like it was going to be amazing. The premise of the book is that it follows a character whose mother ends up, due to reasons, becoming extremely poor. She was rich prior to the book beginning. She becomes extremely poor, and they end up living with the family, the mother, the son, and I believe the daughter end up living with the mother's sister. And yeah, I thought it was going to be a really well constructed riches to rags story, but that's not what I got. I got about 10 pages of this guy trying to deal with having been rich and now being poor, and the rest of it was all about character development that just really annoyed me. So that's where this book was placed, number 4 of the books that I didn't like for the first half of 2020. So now on to medal contenders. Coming in at number 3 and earning the bronze medal for my least favourite books for the first half of 2020 is this book, Goosebumps, My Hairiest Adventure. This is a middle grade horror book, and part of the reason why I wanted to read this book was it was in the same month as I read Pool Boy and as I read Pet Sematary. I had to think there for a moment. But also, part of the reason why I want to read this book is because I used to read Goosebumps growing up, and I loved the series so much that I thought, if I love this one, I'll start reading them all again. My problem with this book is many, and that's why it deserves the bronze medal that it is receiving for least favourite books for my first half of 2020. And to explain it in the best possible way, let's say this book is 200 pages long. It's not, it's less, but let's say it's 200 pages long. I kid you not. The first 198 and a half pages are rather boring. Really, nothing seems to be happening, at least that's going to intrigue me as a reader. Now, you might come back to me and say, well, Mr. Francie, it's a middle grade book and you're not really a middle grade reader, but here's the thing. I have a middle grade book that's going to be on my top 10 list because it's so good. So I don't think middle grade should define whether an adult is going to enjoy the book or not. It was just really boring. Now, we get to the second last page, the second half of the second last page, where a reveal occurs, because basically the premise of this book is that we have the protagonist who you can see on the front cover who's growing hair out of his hands and other places of his body that he shouldn't be because he's too young to be doing this, so he's freaking out and trying to work out why. When we get to the second half of the second last page, the reveal is made. We know why this is happening. It is revealed to him why this is occurring. This was so intriguing. Oh my goodness. I never thought in my wildest dreams that this was going to be the reveal. But then, a page and a half later, the book was done. It's a standalone book, and we didn't go any further, and that really frustrated me. Yes, the Goosebumps books are a series, but most of the books, including this one, are standalones. So the fact that it got really exciting in the last page and a half and didn't go any further was extremely disappointing for me, and that is why this book deserves to be in third place and receive the bronze medal for the books that I liked the least in the first half of 2020. So coming into second place is a book that I no longer have because I borrowed it from the library, but that book is the book that received the silver medal for books that I liked the least out of all the books I read in the first half of 2020, which was The Magicians by Lev Grossman. Now, a little bit of a backstory to this particular book. So this book, I don't know how it did when it first came out, but obviously it did well enough that eventually it was adapted into a TV series. I remember watching the very first episode the night that the very first episode of the TV series came out, and I loved it, and I watched the entire series. It only just finished, I think either this year, it did finish this year. It finished this year, and it finished moments after I started reading the book. I love the series so much. I wish they could have just kept on going, the TV series. So when I found out that this series actually originated from a book, I thought, oh my gosh, I have to start reading this book. So of course I put it on hold, and when it came in my library, I started reading it. It was extremely disappointing, and this is one of the very few times that I'm going to say that a media adaptation, whether it be a TV series or a film, actually did better than the original source material of the book. I can see the bones that they took from the book to place into the TV series, but my gosh, they took so many creative liberties in such a good way, and that's what made it so extremely good. The book itself just really wasn't good at all. I just felt that it wasn't engaging me. I didn't appreciate the characters at all. I didn't appreciate the plot at all. There are some similarities to the first season of the show, because I believe the first book is based on the first season. Sorry, the other way around. I believe the first season of the show is based on the original book. But I just don't like the way that it was done. It just wasn't motivating at all. There was also a ton of curse language used in the book, which I'm not particularly a fan of. If there is a place for it in a book, I'm fine with it, but if it's going to be used for every second word, which it was, then it can be extremely off-putting. It was also extremely graphic, which again, if it has a place in the book and it means something, that's fine. But if you're going to put in graphic, and by graphic I mean sexual content, if you're going to put sexual graphic content into a book and it doesn't have any relevance or any purpose other than to potentially just shock the reader because of how graphic it is, then there's no real reason for it, is there? So for me, it was extremely disappointing, especially considering how much I love the show, and therefore it received the silver medal for the books I liked the least for the first half of 2020. And now it is time to award the gold medal for the book that I liked the least above all the books that I read so far for the first half of 2020. To remind you, I've read 50 books so far this year, and this one, by no small feat, takes the cake. This is the worst of the worst for me. You may disagree, but for me it is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. So this is the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the second book in the Lord of the Rings quadrilogy, and it was extremely boring. Seriously. Had I not granted this series immunity, I doubt I would have continued with this book. I probably would have DNF'd it really early, and I probably wouldn't have even read part 2 or part 3. there was absolutely nothing in this book that I enjoyed. The writing style is extremely tough to read. J.R.R. Tolkien is way too overly descriptive. Most of the time, the characters in this book are going through the whole traveling slash questing trope, worrying about food and water and if they're going to be attacked, and nothing big happens. And again, we have the whole show rather than tell, where one of the characters, especially in this really big scene that occurs off screen, away from what we're reading, happens, and he arrives and talks to the crew and says, well, guess what I've just been through? Da 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 da. Had J.R.R. Tolkien chosen to actually include this scene in the book as a show rather than a tell, maybe it would have rated a lot higher. But there was absolutely nothing that I liked about this book at all. And so, therefore, it received the gold medal for the book that I liked least for all the books that I've read in 2020 for the first half of 2020. Okay, so that is a wrap of all of the books that I liked least for the first half of 2020. I wonder how things would change as we get to the second half of 2020. But in the meantime, I will leave that there. Do you agree with my selection? Do you disagree? Do you think some books should have been placed higher than others? Let me know in the comments section below. But until next time, I post videos every Monday, Thursday, and Sunday. Thank you so much for watching. I'm letting you go. Peace, blessings, and so much love. Mwah. Happy reading. Bye, guys. Bye.